You don't belong here. Those were the words my son's bride chose to throw at me, on the very wedding I paid for. Her voice was sugar, but her eyes were knives, and every guest turned to see if I would crumble. I didn't. I smiled, though my chest burned with years of sacrifice turned into ash. She thought I'd walk away in shame, but I had something far stronger than shame in my hands. She mistook silence for weakness, forgetting I always save my sharpest answer for last. My name is Evelyn Hartman. I am 59 years old, and I have lived long enough to understand that respect is more valuable than diamonds. I raised my son Michael alone after his father's sudden death. I spent decades working double shifts as a nurse, collecting every paycheck like bricks to build our future. That future was meant to stand firm, like the old house I nearly lost twice but always saved. And here, on this polished Savannah estate, my sacrifices were being erased with a single sentence. Michael, 28, stood just beyond her shoulder, his face caught between devotion and confusion. He had dreamed of this day, of stepping into a life that glittered brighter than anything I could offer. Samantha Whitfield, his chosen bride, wore her confidence like a crown. To everyone else, she looked radiant, but I knew better. I had seen how sweetness can rot into control, how charm can be weaponized. The guests clapped politely as if nothing had cracked, but I felt the fracture widening beneath the floor. I clutched the cardboard box pressed against my ribs, filled with tiny jars of honey, wrapped in lace ribbons. Gold labels declaring forever starts now. They were meant as favors for the guests, a sugary symbol of unity. Yet to me, each jar represented the bitterness of financing a dream I had been pushed out of. The glass felt heavier than it should, like I was carrying not gifts, but the weight of my own dismissal. I held that weight without flinching, waiting for my moment. Her eyes met mine again, daring me to leave. She expected a scene, perhaps a broken voice or desperate plea. Instead, I whispered only, "I'll go." The words were calm, measured, almost merciful. But then I added, "Before I do, there's someone you should meet." My smile did not falter, though the air in the room shifted. A few guests leaned forward, sensing a storm wrapped in politeness. I had always believed patience was my greatest weapon, and now it was sharpened to perfection. If you are listening to this now, tell me where you are watching from. Comment your city, your state, maybe even the time on your clock. Because as you hear my story, I want you to imagine how it would feel if decades of sacrifice were erased in a single breath. The truth is, Samantha had been rehearsing my erasure long before that morning. The night before the wedding, she sent me a message that carried the same poison wrapped in politeness. It read, "You really don't need to be there tomorrow, we already have enough mothers in the room." I stared at the words until they blurred on the screen. She wasn't asking. She was warning me that the celebration would proceed more smoothly if I disappeared from sight, like an unwanted shadow. I didn't answer her message. Instead, I thought of the years I spent piecing my son's life together from scraps. Every overtime shift in the emergency room, every bill negotiated, every secondhand coat patched at the seams so he would have a chance to stand tall. That house in Richmond was more than walls and paint. It was proof that grit could survive storms. And yet, in a few careless sentences, she tried to sever me from the very future I built for him. Michael was blinded by her charm, or perhaps by the ease her family's wealth offered. He didn't see how her father's tight smile dismissed me during planning meetings, or how her mother's eyes skimmed past me as though I were staff. They spoke of traditions, of heritage, of names carved into silver, but none of those things had ever kept a roof over my child's head. Still, Michael stood proudly beside them, convinced that love could dissolve the quiet cruelties I endured at their table. I remember sitting alone in my kitchen the night before, staring at the honey jars stacked like bricks against the wall. Each one labeled "Forever starts now," yet for me forever had already been spent. I had poured it into Michael's childhood, into every scraped knee and midnight fever, into years of silence where no one applauded. And now forever was being rewritten by a woman who wanted me erased from the first line. My patience turned to steel in those hours. When dawn came, I dressed carefully, not as a guest but as a witness. My presence would not be silent compliance, nor would it be a scene of chaos. I would walk in steady, I would sit where I pleased, and when the moment came, I would speak. I carried no hatred on my face, only the mask of restraint. But deep inside, I was already planning the shift that would turn her sweetness into ashes, before the crowd she had carefully gathered. And if you're still watching me unravel this story, don't move just yet. Stay with me until the end, because what began as a whisper of dismissal became something far louder than vows. You will see how one sentence can topple years of pretense, how a smile can split open a room. And you might ask yourself, if it were your child standing there, would you have left quietly? Or would you have stayed long enough to remind them who truly built their tomorrow? She smiled at me as if nothing had happened, that same dazzling expression she practiced for cameras and photographs. To the guests, Samantha was the perfect bride, her gown shimmering under the chandelier, her posture poised like royalty. But I had lived long enough to recognize the cracks beneath polished surfaces. Her sweetness was not generosity, it was a shield, and like every shield, it hid a weapon behind it, ready to slice anyone who dared threaten her control. I kept my place, standing at the edge of the room, watching the layers of deception play out. The vows, the rehearsed speeches, the curated image of two families merging into one flawless picture. But beneath the lace and gold, I could see the lie spreading like mold under paint. Michael, blinded by devotion, held her hand as though it was a lifeline. He didn't realize the rope he gripped was already tightening into a noose. Her voice rang out, thanking everyone for coming, praising her parents, praising her friends, praising the image of a life she had carefully assembled. My name was never spoken, though my money had paid for every inch of this pageantry. I waited in silence, my smile fixed. Every omission carved deeper into me, but it also sharpened the blade I carried inside. She thought exclusion could erase me, but erasure only makes memory more dangerous. At one point, her eyes caught mine again, just long enough for her lips to curl. It wasn't kindness, it was warning. The kind of warning that tells you your seat has been removed, your voice muted, your presence tolerated only until the lights dim. I let her believe her warning worked. The beauty of silence is that it doesn't reveal the storm brewing beneath it. I wasn't here to shout, I was here to end illusions with a single move. I tightened my grip on the box of favors, pressed against my ribs, those little jars of honey promising forever. I almost laughed at the irony. Forever doesn't start now, I thought. Forever already started decades ago, when I gave my life to Michael's survival. Forever had been earned in quiet nights and broken hands, not in staged ceremonies and curated smiles. And soon, forever would speak louder than her voice ever could, even if it was only through mine. The house I fought to keep became the anchor of every thought as I stood in that hall. Brick by brick, mortgage after mortgage, I saved it from the claws of banks and storms alike. That house was not just wood and stone, it was my battlefield and my crown. Losing it would have meant surrendering not only walls, but the years of dignity carved into every nail. And yet here, on this wedding floor, that very legacy was being mocked. I thought of the winters when the heater failed, and I wrapped Michael in blankets until morning light. I thought of the meals stretched thin, the nights I worked double shifts in the hospital so his shoes would not carry holes. Each sacrifice was cement poured into the foundation of that house. To him, it was only home. To me, it was blood crystallized into shelter. And now, Samantha's family looked at me as if my sacrifices were nothing more than loose change. Her father's hand had brushed mine earlier that week during planning, quick and dismissive. He spoke of contracts and payments, but never of gratitude. He saw me as the woman who signed checks, not as the mother who forged a man out of hardship. His voice had been smooth when he said, "Don't worry, we'll take it from here." But I heard the steel beneath it. They wanted my son, my money, and my silence. 3 things I refused to give all at once. When the vows echoed through the room, I did not hear love, I heard a transaction. Promises gilded with gold, yet hollow as a cracked jar. Samantha's smile widened as she glanced toward her parents, as though she had delivered exactly what they demanded. My son neatly wrapped, his future tied with a bow, but bows can come undone. And as they tightened their grip on him, I tightened mine on everything I had yet to reveal. It is a strange thing, to feel centuries of tradition pressing against your back while knowing you stand alone. But standing alone had always been my strength. I carried Michael alone, I built our survival alone. And if I had to shatter their illusion, I would do it alone as well. What they mistook for weakness was simply patience, waiting for its hour, and when patience expires, it does not whisper. It detonates. If you are still with me, leave a comment below and tell me how You ever kept quiet when you knew the truth could burn a room to the ground? I want to know if you too have felt that fire sitting heavy in your chest, waiting for the moment to release it. Because that was exactly where I stood, in silence, holding the match. The power they thought they held over me was never truly theirs. Money had been my language for months, my name scribbled across invoices and contracts, yet they mistook it for obedience. What they didn't know was that control runs both ways. Every signature I placed was not a gift, but a tether, and tethers can be pulled tight or cut loose. They wanted me invisible, yet every corner of the celebration still bore my mark. Samantha had spoken often of her vision for the perfect day, a vision bought with my sweat and years. She ordered flowers by the truckload. Chandeliers hung like crowns, champagne stacked in towers, all of it dazzling, all of it fragile. Without my hand steadying the foundation, every detail would collapse. She never saw that truth. Her arrogance was the blindfold she tied herself, and I held the scissors that could slice it apart. I remembered her voice during the rehearsal dinner, dripping with charm as she raised a glass. She toasted her parents for their generosity, her friends for their support, even Michael for his devotion. My name never surfaced. My silence that night was not submission. It was calculation. Her words polished the lie, but lies are glass, and glass shatters with the smallest crack. I had already prepared the hammer, though she had yet to see it. Her father once leaned across the table, confident, his tone almost mocking. He said, "Evelyn, sometimes it's best to step aside and let the young ones take the lead." His smile was professional, his meaning lethal. I didn't reply. What he failed to see was that stepping aside does not mean surrendering the field. It means standing at the edge, watching, waiting, and striking when your absence turns into their undoing. The favors pressed against my ribs were heavier that night than they had any right to be. Tiny jars of honey, sweet symbols of a promise I never believed. Forever starts now, the labels read, but forever had already been pwned for appearances. Each jar I carried reminded me that sweetness can sour, that sugar can rot into poison, and I was ready to hand that truth back to the bride who dared to erase me. Before I move forward, if you believe silence has a power greater than shouting, share this video with someone who understands the weight of holding back until the perfect moment. Because what came next was not chance, it was the strike I had been sharpening for years, and when it landed, the room would never recover. I let the room believe I had surrendered. My lips curved in that patient smile mothers wear when the world underestimates them. Samantha's triumph glowed as she floated between tables, convinced her performance was flawless. But while her voice carried rehearsed sweetness, I held something real, something stronger than vows or flowers. My silence was not the end. It was the drumbeat before thunder, and everyone in that hall was about to hear the storm. At my side, waiting for the signal, stood Lauren Pierce. Once Samantha's closest friend in college, now the shadow of everything she tried to bury. Lauren's presence alone was a mirror, reflecting cracks that no lace or lipstick could conceal. I had asked her to come, not for vengeance alone, but for truth. She had seen Samantha's web long before Michael ever walked into it, and tonight, her mere arrival would speak louder than my words. I called softly across the room, "Samantha, there's someone here you should greet." My voice carried just enough strength to cut through the music. Every head turned, every whisper hushed. Lauren stepped forward, her eyes steady, her expression calm, yet unflinching. Samantha's hand froze around her champagne glass. For one fleeting second, her mask slipped, and the sweetness drained from her face. She knew the past had walked into her wedding uninvited, and it terrified her. The silence that followed was heavier than any speech. Guests shifted, unsure, curiosity sparking like fire through dry grass. Michael looked from me to Lauren, confusion twisting across his face. Samantha whispered something no one caught, her voice trembling where confidence once lived. The room didn't need an explanation. They only needed to see her reaction, the faint color leaving her cheeks. The breath stolen from her lungs, the truth etched into her collapse. Then it happened. Her knees buckled, and the bride who moments before ruled the hall with honeyed words fell into the arms of her startled bridesmaids. Gasps rippled through the guests like waves against stone. Lauren stood silent, offering no speech, no accusation, just the undeniable weight of her presence. And in that moment, I did not need to raise my voice. Samantha's own fear became my most eloquent sentence. If you are still with me, don't just listen. Write in the comments what you would have said if you had been in my place. Would you have spoken aloud, or would you have let silence be the dagger? Your answer matters, because every choice in moments like these defines who truly holds power. And tonight, the power was mine. The air fractured the moment Samantha collapsed, her gown sprawling like spilled milk across the polished floor. Gasps turned to whispers, whispers to murmurs, until the hall trembled under the weight of suspicion. Guests craned their necks, half in shock, half in hunger for scandal. The music stuttered into silence, leaving only the rustle of silk and the uneven sound of her shallow breath. A celebration had twisted into theater, and every eye searched for meaning. Her father, Charles Whitfield, went pale beneath his tailored suit. The man who once spoke with arrogance now clenched his jaw, scanning the room for answers he could not control. His hands fidgeted at his cufflinks, the only crack in his carefully curated poise. His empire was real estate, but at that moment, the ground beneath him felt anything but steady. He glanced at me once, and for the first time, his stare carried no authority, only fear. Michael's confusion bled into panic. My son rushed toward Samantha, his hand trembling as he reached for hers. His voice faltered when he whispered, "Sam, what's happening?" He looked at me, searching my face for an explanation, but I gave him none. This was not my chaos to untangle. It was Samantha's web unraveling before him, each thread snapping under the pressure of truth. My silence forced him to see what I had long known. The bridesmaids hovered nervously, fanning her, whispering her name, trying to revive the image of a perfect bride. But Lauren stood tall, her presence unshaken, a monument to everything Samantha feared. Not one word passed her lips, and yet her silence screamed through the room. People watched Samantha tremble, her polished mask shattered beyond repair. They didn't need proof or testimony. They needed only to witness her crumble in front of the life she tried to steal. Every whisper in that hall painted the same picture. Something wasn't right, something had been hidden. Faces turned from admiration to judgment in seconds. The same guests who clapped at her speech now raised brows, their curiosity sharper than knives. The Whitfield's prestige was slipping like sand through fingers. I stood still, carrying the box of favors at my ribs. No longer heavy but light, almost buoyant. For the first time, the weight was no longer mine to bear. The storm I had carried in silence finally settled over the room, and I stood in its calm center. Samantha lay pale on the floor, her bridesmaids fluttering around her like broken wings, while her father's face sagged under the weight of disgrace. The whispers had hardened into judgment, and though no one spoke my name, every eye turned toward me. They expected me to explain, to soothe, to bow out. They were about to learn, I do none of those things. I took one step forward, steady and deliberate, and the room parted without command. My years had taught me that authority is not in volume but in presence, and presence was the only crown I needed. I looked at Michael, my son, the boy I had raised from scraped knees to manhood. His lips trembled, his eyes wide with questions. He whispered, "Mom, what did you do?" I didn't flinch. I gave him only the truth he had refused to see. I said, "I gave her the mirror she's been running from. Nothing more." My words hung in the air, unembellished, undeniable. Lauren remained silent at my side, her presence proof enough of history Samantha had tried to bury. No accusations, no documents, no shouting. Just a shadow from her past, standing under the same chandelier as her lies. The bride had fainted, the guests had witnessed, and all I had done was open the door she locked behind her. Charles tried to gather himself, his voice cracking under the strain. He muttered something about stress, about fainting spells, about Samantha needing air, but no one heard him. They weren't listening to explanations anymore. They were watching the empire his family had crafted splinter into fragments. Margot's pearl necklace rattled against her throat as she bent to lift her daughter. But the pearls looked less like wealth now, and more like chains, snapping loose one by one. Michael's hand reached for me again, desperate. He whispered, "Tell me it isn't true." I met his eyes with the calmness of years, the strength of sacrifice. I didn't answer with denial or comfort. I simply said, "You'll have to ask your bride when she wakes." The words landed heavier than any accusation I could have thrown. The hall was silent, save for the faint hum of whispers, building like bees circling the honey jars pressed against my ribs. Before I leave you here, share this story with someone who knows what it feels like to carry decades of sacrifice, only to be told they don't belong. Share it so they know silence can roar louder than screams, and truth can stand taller than facades. Because my next move would not only end this wedding, it would remind them all whose name had built the ground beneath their feet. The silence after my last words stretched into eternity. Samantha remained limp in her mother's arms, the portrait of a bride undone not by accident, but by truth. The guests were frozen, their polished shoes rooted to the floor, their champagne untouched. Every detail they had come to admire now looked like excess, every sparkle turned hollow. I knew then it was time to leave, not in shame, but in power. My departure would be my final sentence. I walked slowly toward the exit, each step deliberate. The box of honey jars pressed firm against my ribs. The labels shimmered beneath the lights. Forever starts now, a cruel joke, I thought, because forever had already begun decades ago in a small Richmond kitchen, when I swore to keep my son alive no matter the cost. I carried those jars as relics of sacrifice turned spectacle, and now I would decide their true meaning. Michael called after me, his voice shaking. "Mom, don't go like this," but I didn't turn back. I had given him life, shelter, education, love, everything. He was built on, and yet, he chose blindness over loyalty. My answer was simple, carved from years of restraint. I said, "You will understand one day, when the sweetness you're clinging to finally turns bitter." His silence told me the words had pierced deeper than tears ever could. At the door, Charles tried once more to salvage his pride. "Evelyn, this is unnecessary," he muttered, but his voice lacked the weight it once carried. I met his eyes calm as stone, and replied, "You wanted me gone. Now live with what that absence costs." It wasn't anger in my tone, it was certainty, the kind that leaves no room for rebuttal. He lowered his gaze, and in that moment, the empire he guarded cracked again. I placed the box of favors on the nearest table and slid one jar forward. "Forever starts now." The label gleamed. For them, it was an empty promise. For me, it was a declaration. Forever is mine, earned in silence, guarded in blood, not purchased in gold. I left the jar behind as proof that sweetness, without substance, eventually curdles. Then I opened the door, stepped into the night, and felt the weight of years finally lift from my chest. And if you stayed with me until the end, tell me in the comments, what would your final words have been before leaving that hall? Would you have shouted? Would you have begged? Or would you, like me, have chosen silence sharpened into a blade? Whatever your answer, remember this. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply walks away, leaving the echoes to do the work.